The Edmonton Oilers are committed to Trent Frederic for the next 8 years. Does that make sense? On today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we've got your team covered every day. And today's show is brought to you by FanDuel, where right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So on today's show, we are going to unpack Trent Frederic from a few different angles. I love doing these deep dives. This is one of my favorite episode formats I love to do. We've done a series of them over the course of my 3 years as host of Locked On Oilers. I find it is very illuminative to go through players and try and understand their circumstances, because so much of production, as we understand it in hockey, counting stats, goals, assists, is environment dependent. It is situation dependent. And just because a player has a certain type of success or doesn't in one situation doesn't necessarily mean it will carry over or translate to another. So to start out, we will analyze Trent Frederic's usage throughout his career. We're mostly going to focus on his time with the Bruins, because I don't feel that the compromised version we saw in the postseason is going to be particularly useful for understanding what's to come. I think there's a lot to glean from just what the Bruins asked of Trent Frederic in the early stages of his NHL career, even though he's still a relatively young player, especially when you consider how old most of the Oilers are. And then we're going to pivot to our second segment to trying to understand his underlying numbers in terms of scoring chances, shots on goal, those types of things that give clarity as to how sustainable a player's production is. And then we'll tie a bow on it, talking about why a lot of this signing, at least in my opinion, looks to be based in projection and what could happen as opposed to what we think is going to happen. So to start out, let's be very clear. And I have expressed this ad nauseum in the course of this offseason, because when we are talking about player transactions, environment in hockey is really hard to overcome. That's what makes the game-breaking talent so special. The McDavids, the Panarins, the Kucherovs, the Kaprizovs, the Eichels, the Marners, the Matthews, the Nylander, the great players, the guys who can make plays outside of structure, largely on their own, without help from their line mates or without help from defensive players breaking the puck out. Those are the players who stand out as being the best of the best, because they are one-man offenses. For the vast majority, probably 95% of the players in the NHL, they're not on that threshold. They don't have the skating ability. They don't have the shooting ability. They don't have the positional instincts. They are not on that level where they're going to be able to overcome their environment. So the first factor to consider when we are evaluating a player, as always, and my everydayers know, is ice time. The more ice time you earn, the more likely you are to create offense. And there are several offshoots of that. So, number one, the more minutes you play, the more likely you are to be a better player. The more minutes you play, the more likely you are to play more prominently in the lineup. You're going to be a first or a second liner. The more minutes you play, the more likely you are to be on one of, if not both, special teams units. And really quickly, you start to understand how a young player goes from a third liner to a top sixer to a first liner to a power play, penalty kill, all situations guy. The best of the best can do all three at a reasonably high level. Those are the types of guys who are amongst the rarest and most valuable in the NHL. Now, most players are not going to be at that level, so you have to be a little more specialized. What are you good at? Board checking, shot suppression, penalty killing. And I think penalty killing as a trait is a little, I won't say fugazi, but it's a little bit less sticky and consistent than some of the other traits we would identify as being quality or something we would want for players. Continuing on, once you get past that, the other environmental factors, quality of competition. Who are you out there against? What can be realistically expected of you based on who you're playing against? On top of that, who are you playing with? Are you out there with guys who are expected to create offense? Because then by association, if you're out there with two guys as a forward who are offense first guys, the expectation is you're going to be cheating for offense a little bit. You aren't going to be as preoccupied with defensive impact because you're going to want to create offense, because your expectation based on your deployment, who you're playing with, the minutes you're playing, and the quality of competition, that all tells you a lot about what a team thinks of a guy. And when you go and look at Trent Frederic's numbers based on his usage over his career, you can tell the Bruins didn't really have a path to him to significant roles. A career average season for Trent Frederic is 26 points. It's 12.6 and 12.6 goals and assists, 117 shots on goal over 82 games. We're talking about 1.2, 1.1 shots per game on 11.3 shooting percentage, which is slightly above average. So that leads you to believe that potentially there's a little bit more meat on the bone there should he shoot the puck a little bit more, considering he's only averaging about 1.25 shot, less than 1.5 shots on goal per game. That tells you there's a little bit something there, especially considering he's over 11% as a shooter for his career. The next component, when he's only averaging 12 minutes and 24 seconds per game, that tells you an awful lot about what the Bruins were using him for throughout the early stages of career. This is a depth forward. This is a bottom six guy. He's not on your first line. He's not on your power play. He's not on your penalty kill, or at least your first power play or penalty kill. I know he averaged about 40 power play seconds per game, like 20 penalty kill seconds per game this past year as a Bruin. But you are not seizing your moment. You are not making the Bruins play you more. And look, the Bruins, for much of Frederic's career, were a very good team. He was on the team the year they won the President's Trophy. They set the record for points in a season in the 82-game format we currently operate under. The Bruins have been perennial Stanley Cup contenders up until this past season. And with that, you have to understand that those teams, very much similar to the conversation we've had about the Oilers and their young players for this upcoming season, not as inclined to give guys more opportunities to play their way into bigger roles, to get opportunities to not only play their way into bigger roles, but have those bigger roles become featured components of a team. And you think about it, playing with Charlie Coyle, Pavel Zacha, Morgan Geekie, useful to good hockey players, but those lines aren't out there to create offense. And you don't need to be an offensively inclined player to be valuable. There are plenty of defense first guys, even though you would typically say that's more preferred for defensemen than forwards. An elite defensive forward without points on the other end isn't that valuable. That's what makes a Mitch Marner or a Mark Stone so great, is those guys are special defensive talents on top of being prestigious and frankly very gifted offensive hockey players. So you have to understand that the more specialized you are, the fewer things you're good at, the more you need to master those individual traits. And it's what makes guys like Frederick, who profile as a certain type of player, really interesting, because by and large, the Oilers look to be investing in something that they think the Bruins didn't see. Because this term, 8 years for a player and look, Frederick's not old at 26, but it feels like you didn't really need to go that crazy for a guy whose career high in points is like 30. It feels like there's a greater opportunity there. And look, maybe the Oilers do see something. Maybe the Oilers think that by playing with better players like he might in Edmonton this upcoming year, they might be able to get more out of him. But speaking of getting more out of Trent Frederic, we are going to take our first break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, I'm going to tell you what Trent Frederic's underlying numbers mean for the chances of him becoming an even more productive player coming up next. So be sure to stick around. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, high-stakes soccer, or the WNBA, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburnt at the beach. FanDuel makes it so easy to stay in the action leading up to the game or after the game starts with live betting. The app keeps it fresh with new daily promotions and fun ways to bet. The FanDuel app is easy to use, fast to pay out, and makes even regular season games feel like must-watch events. And If you're new to FanDuel, there's never been a better time to sign up. New customers can bet just $5 and win $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com. And new customers, one more time, can earn as much as $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com or the FanDuel app today to get started. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers as we talk about Trent Frederic, the long-term signing of Trent Frederic, which could come at a real surprise to me as someone who saw I don't want to say diminished because that feels maybe a bit unfair because we're talking about an injured player as opposed to an older player. But Trent Frederic very clearly was not at 100% in the postseason. It felt like there was more to squeeze there, and it just never looked fully right. As the playoffs went along, he looked a little more comfortable, but by and large, never really felt particularly enamored with the Trent Frederic experience as an Oiler. And look, I'm not saying there isn't value here, that the Oilers are wrong for doing this. I just think it's really interesting. It's really curious why you would go so long on a player who doesn't put up counting stats and his style of play doesn't particularly age well. This is someone who forechecks, who hits a lot, who fights a lot. And these types of archetypes do not play into their mid-30s. You know, we talk about the greats, guys like Sidney Crosby, who can play to 37 or 38 because they started at such a high peak. They have certain skills that won't dissipate with age, particularly the intelligence and positioning stuff that you have an innate understanding of from having played so much hockey. But when you talk about a guy who, like Frederick, who in mid-20s, less than 400 career NHL games played, less than 13 minutes per game, not a power play, not a penalty kill. We're talking about 26 points as a career average. It's just really interesting why teams feel compelled to lock up these types of players. And look, I think there's a world where Trent Frederic can be the Oilers' long-term third-line center if all things break well for him. I think there's a world where he could see himself playing as a pseudo Evander Kane on this team next year, running on McDavid or Draisaitl's left, depending on what happens with Ryan Nugent-Hopkins or with Ike Howard. You know, would it surprise me if Chris Knobloch wanted to run Nuge as the third-line center, Henrique as a wing, and try to get more offense out of Trent Frederic, you know, former first-round pick, someone who's got an above-average NHL shot based on his career shooting percentage? It's not out of the question. But continuing and tugging on that thread, one of the factors for evaluating the potential for a breakout are the underlying numbers. Underlying numbers are not the be-all, end-all. I think they are extremely useful for understanding how a player plays, what their impact on a given game is. But I do think, of course, there are players who always consistently outperform their metrics, and there are players who underperform their metrics. Some of the keys to understanding, number one, although quality is more important than quantity when it comes to offense, you'd be better off with 15 high danger chances than 35 low danger or medium danger chances. They are not a predictive indicator of what's to come. Just because one player consistently outshoots the other team or out expected goals or out high dangers the other team, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to score more. There are plenty of guys who are really good at game control offense. You know, I think about those Calgary Flames teams under Darryl Sutter in the early part of this decade with Tkachuk and Johnny Gaudreau, Elias Lindholm, Blake Coleman, Mangiapane, Michael Backlund, really gifted players. And in the case of Coleman, Mangiapane, Backlund, great at working the cycle. And the cycle, as you can tell by watching the Hurricanes and looking at their underlying numbers, it's not like the Hurricanes are actively trying to juice their underlying numbers, but their style of play, that volume-based offense, lots of cycling, high to low, point shots, tips, deflections, rebounds, a lot of that type of play does a great job of controlling the state of the game. And at large, the Hurricanes don't play a lot of defense. So their guys really do try and hone in on and focus on defensemen who are good at moving the puck. That way, they play even less defense than they would have already, considering how much possession they generally hold. And in the case of someone like Trent Frederic, who is typically playing on a third line or a fourth line, on the Oilers, I would assume he's going to start on the third line. There is plenty of opportunity for Trent Frederic to play his way into a bigger role. But when you look at the underlying numbers, And look, let's be very clear here. Trent Frederic's not a play driver. This is not someone who's going to create offense for himself or for his line mates. This is a supporting role. This is someone who's going to forecheck, who's going to engage on the cycle, and someone who's going to fight on occasion, someone who's going to block shots, who's got a long reach, who's an okay skater. This is someone whose skill set is very set up to be a low event hockey player. And what do I mean by low event? A low event hockey player is someone who is trying to bring the temperature of the game down. Someone who's going to get the puck in deep. They're going to cycle the puck in the offensive zone for 45 seconds to a minute. They're going to control the ice for the time they're out there. They're going to put the other team on their heels. They're going to be in their own end. They're going to have defensemen and forwards moving around trying to play defense. Their goalie is tracking the puck, moving post to post, trying to keep himself as square as possible. You add all that up, it doesn't necessarily lead to offense. You can be a really good third or fourth line, work the cycle. That doesn't mean you're going to score. Is it more likely you'll score if you have the puck more? Yes, but it's not a given. It's not a guarantee. And that's why we say these underlying numbers are descriptive as opposed to predictive. They tell you what's already happened, and over the course of a big sample, they can be predictive and give you a bit of an understanding of how a player plays. But at large, they're not going to particularly be that valuable just on their own. And that's where you got to understand the context. Because like I'm looking at Trent Frederic's natural stat trick right now. Trent Frederic has never had a season where his team outscoring chanced his opposition. They've been close, a couple 49%ers, but in Trent Frederic's NHL career, and again, not a huge sample size as far as games played, outscored opponents 3 seasons, out expected goals opponents 3 seasons, out high danger chanced opponents in 4 seasons. So with those underlying numbers, and again, you got to remember, this is a supporting role. This is not the same thing as talking about Connor McDavid and his scoring chances and high danger chances and expected goals. Trent Frederic can't do that. He can manufacture possession. He can be an active component in a good checking line, but he's not going to drive offense in the traditional sense. He is not going to be a 50 to 70 point guy. I think the absolute highest range outcome for someone like Trent Frederic is a 50 point season. I don't think the puck skills are there. I think the underlying numbers would tell you he is largely a product of who he plays with. I think in an ideal world, you get him to play as the retriever for a better, more distribution-oriented forward and a shoot-first forward. Now, Frederic, he's not a slouch. He's not a bad shooter. He can get himself in reasonable positions. He does have an above career average shooting percentage, but that's not really his game. That's not what he's good at. Can he do it? Sure. Every hockey player needs to be able to shoot the puck a little bit. You know, you think about the difference between Trent Frederic and somebody you're going to see in a men's league. We're talking about 2 different animals, let alone 2 different types of hockey players. But amongst his NHL contemporaries, this isn't a player who shoots the puck a whole lot. This isn't a player who facilitates offense a whole lot. He's here to be a meat and potatoes, hard hat, lunch pail, forechecking guy. He is here to hit. He is here to be annoying. He is here to instigate fights. And he's here to try and give the Oilers more dimensions to their lineup as opposed to just being a straightforward rush team or a straightforward cycle team. The Oilers want the best of both worlds. And we are going to take our second and final break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, I'm going to tell you why a lot of this Trent Frederic move is projection, not based on evidence. Coming up next on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers as we break down Trent Frederic, what his numbers say, and what he means. And I think that's my favorite part about doing these types of episodes is trying to get in the weeds, is trying to understand what a team, general manager, a coach, what do they see in this guy that I don't? And of course, I don't have that type of trained eye. I'm not an NHL general manager. I'm not an NHL head coach. But you can typically put together a pretty good understanding of a player's capacities based on their track record. Because once you get to a certain point in a player's career, which is generally 25 or 26, they're pretty defined in what they are. You have 4 or 5, maybe even as many as 6 if they debuted at 19 or 20 years to build a range of outcomes. You get an understanding of what the best they can do, what the worst they can do, and you get a broad understanding of what they're capable of. And the more players you have that have a wider end range of potential outcomes, the more volatility you're going to introduce to your team. That's why generally Stanley Cup contenders are on the older side, and not like the oldest, even though the Oilers have been generally amongst the older teams in the NHL the last 2 seasons. They're very established. You're not seeing a lot of rookies. You're not seeing a lot of sophomores on teams that are in the Stanley Cup final, that are losing in the Stanley Cup final, hell, that are even in just the conference final, because teams that are that good are very reticent to give ice time to players who are trying to figure it out. They would much rather spend that ice time on a low event player who can control the game state. In an ideal world, that's what Trent Frederick's going to bring to the Oilers this upcoming season. With a full off season, hopefully he'll be as close to full health as he can be by the start of the season in October. But the Oilers here are really going out on a limb and giving Trent Frederic this type of term and this type of contract. Over time, the $3.8 million will seem relatively quaint. I think over time, it'll be close. It'll feel about what $2 million per year is worth. And Trent Frederic is for sure worth $2 million in the current environment. So I'm not particularly worried about the money perspective of it in an ideal world. And look, I'm going to have to rework my formula going forward because the cap is going to explode. But historically, I have always operated under the assumption that for every 10 points you produce, it's worth about $1 million. If you produce 100 points, you're a $10 million player. The more goals, $1.5 million, $1.25 million, something like that. That way you're operating. So hypothetically, if Trent Frederic, we were going to go on his career averages, 13 points, 13 assists. So he would get $1,300,000 for the assists. And then for the goals, we'd say something in the ballpark of $1.5 million per goal. That gets you to close to $3 million per year, $3.5 million per year for Trent Frederic. And look, money in this environment is going to get very funky very fast. It's going to require recalibration on all of our parts. Same thing with term. I can't wait to see what the next crop of stars do, including McDavid, including Kaprizov, because if Connor wants to go for 4 years at $14, $15, $16, $17 million per year, well, we're going to run this conversation back in 3 summers when he's 31 and he's going to have to make a decision. Do I want to do it again? Do I want to keep re-racking to adjust for inflation? Well, I think there's a reasonable argument he should. Now, that doesn't have a whole lot to do with Trent Frederic, of course, but just you have to think about these conversations in the greater context. And I don't know what Stan Bowman thinks Trent Frederic's ideal role is. I think there's a capacity for Trent Frederic to be a fringe top 6 winger. I think on a good team, he'd be a third line winger. I think the Oilers, if, say, Ike Howard struggles or Andrew Mangiapane struggles, I think they could be inclined to give Trent Frederic a serious look up there. And then all it takes is a few good weeks. And that's really the beauty, of having some of these interchangeable wingers the way the Oilers do. We talked about this pretty in depth last week, the idea that the Oilers have 6 guys for a bunch of spots, and how they shake out is going to almost be entirely incumbent upon how each guy performs in relation to each other and how well they gel with the other candidates. Because I could see a world where Frederic is the third line center, where he's the second line left wing, the first line left wing, or the third line right wing. I could see a world where Ryan Nugent-Hopkins is the third line center, so they give Trent Frederic time with Connor McDavid. I could see a world where he's the second line winger because they want to play Podkolzin lower in the lineup. There are a lot of paths here for a Trent Frederic to play into a bigger role. And the last part of this, and something I do think people overlook from time to time, because it does require being a little bit cynical. Once a team invests money and term in you, they have skin in the game now. So not only are you invested in your outcome, the Oilers are now materially invested in Trent Frederic becoming a better hockey player. That's not to say they were sabotaging him or they weren't putting him in a position to succeed during this post-trade deadline moonlight period. But at the very least, you do have to understand the difference. Because now, if Trent Frederic stinks, The Oilers are stuck with him. They are stuck with that contract. They are stuck with that money. But if he plays well and he earns himself a bigger role, they get to look a little bit smarter. And look, nobody's signing anybody who underperforms to try and rehabilitate their production to look smart. They're doing it because it's a market inefficiency. They are taking a gamble, an informed gamble, of course, but they are taking a risk. They are assuming that in a better environment, they're going to be able to get more. And that's very clearly what the Oilers play here as far as Trent Frederic goes. I wouldn't be surprised if Frederick finished with 30 points next year. I'd be surprised if he finished with more than 50 because that would be a major outlier amongst his production. But he's also never played with a Connor McDavid, a Leon Draisaitl caliber player consistently. You know, spurts here and there with guys like David Pastrnak are cool and all, but if Trent Frederic plays well and earns himself top 6 ice time, maybe sneaks onto the second power play, one of the first 4 penalty kill forwards after Kapanen and some of their other guys like Nuge, etc. There is a world for Trent Frederic to become a pretty useful middle 6 hockey player here. And the Oilers, by virtue of the money they've spent on him, by the term they've given him, are going to be invested in him reaching that potential. Now, of course, the counterpoint to that is he's 27 years old. He has 109 career points in 338 career games. That's not exactly gaudy production. At this point, I think it's pretty safe to say this is close to what Trent Frederic is. Now, again, if he gets a bigger role, the counting stats can change. As far as efficiency, skill set, this is what he is. He's a good cycle player. He hits a lot. He likes to do the after the whistle shenanigans, which I know the hockey men still like. I would love to see a world where Trent Frederic finds a way to become a valuable piece for the Oilers going forward and effectively turns into a bargain, because at that number, if they can get 40 points out of him, that's a steal. But that will just about do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Thank you to everybody who made Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we've got your team covered every day. Be sure to check out Locked On NHL and Locked On NHL Game Night for more around the league. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.